Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome your host, Mr. Sidney Brownwood.
Hello, good evening, and welcome to the latest Lardy Oddcast. Here we're back in the Lard Island studio, talking to the Rogers and Hammerstein of wargaming. Richard Clark and Nick Skinner. Chat, welcome to the Oddcast.
Well, thank you very much, Sidney.
Which is which?
I don't think I can tell either.
Ted Rogers.
Let's not go there. So this week we're going to sidestep the postbag and head straight for the workshop.
Is that due to the conversation we had last time?
I'm going to comment on that. Still discussing that one. And we're going to head straight for the workshop to find out what we've all been busy with since we last met.
Well, here we are, and actually this time I'm asking the questions because we've been transported magically not to the Lard Island workshop, but the workshop at Roundwood Towers. Sidney, thank you for allowing us into your home. It was well worth the 3 hours going through the security process to get in. Now tell us, Sid, this is an opulent and spacious workshop. Would you like to show us around and tell the listeners what you've been up to?
Well, thank you for joining me in my eclectic workshop. So this year, and in fact last year, and much of the previous year as well, I've been painting some kind of old school 25mm figures, mainly from Wargames Foundry and from Dixon's, but also with a few newer figures, really for the late 17th century. So in the previous Oddcast we've talked about English Civil War and in the buff, and for a long time one of my interests has been not so much the English Civil War but the 50 years which comes after that, which is really from about 1650 to 1700. So I've been working on both French and Grand Alliance armies for that particular period, with a long-standing goal really of getting some figures on the table during the course of this year, really in 25mm, and looking really at sort of battalion-sized actions, so 4, 5, 6, 7 battalions aside on the table. So I've been working on really the Spanish, Imperial and also German cavalry regiments in 25mm, and both heavy sort of cuirassier type cavalry and also more sort of almost like Reiter type cavalry as they were called at the time. And that's been a bit of a labour of love for a lot of reasons. It's not a period which is well served in English language history books. There's a couple of books from the Pike and Shot Society which are excellent, relating to the flags and uniforms of the time, but information is still quite difficult to find about how formations fought, how they were deployed in size, and actually about some of the battles in which they fought. And that's part of the pleasure of following a period which isn't really well known and where there's not much written about it. So the way I decided to do this was not to sort of kind of slavishly follow history, because to be honest that's really difficult to find out about, you know, what the uniforms were, the different sizes in, say, the French-Dutch War of 1672 to 1678. Especially if you don't speak Flemish or Dutch or German particularly well, and you don't really have access... Or French. You don't have access to the archival sources.
Or even English.
So what I tried to do is theme the different units based around some of the uniforms that we do have information for as much as possible, but also extrapolate backwards and forwards from things like the 30 Years' War and from all the Spanish Succession to really get two armies which really look good on the tabletop.
Right, so these armies here that we're looking at, what you're saying is that all the uniforms are made up?
No, that's not what I'm saying, but some of them definitely are. So for example with the Spanish infantry, those uniforms that you can see on those 6 or 7 regiments, those are completely accurate, but the flags aren't actually known. What happens with the Spanish flags?
You want to be careful with flags after last time.
We do have to be very careful about flags, but I don't think anyone's going to object about these flags. So what happens is the French capture significant numbers of Spanish trophies in the War of Devolution, in the Franco-Dutch Wars, and they're displayed in Notre Dame.
Right.
And there are paintings taken at the time of those flags. Now, the French who captured those flags didn't actually identify which units they captured from.
No.
So they've got a lot of information about the Spanish flags, which you see painted on the battalions there.
Yeah.
But we don't know which units they came from. So it gives a degree of largesse really towards somebody who's trying to create an army. So the great pleasure I've had is trying to fit as much history in there as possible, but then just sort of reasonable recreation of information, which we do have, and sort of fitting them together as to what looks good. So there is an element of imaginations there, but also it's based around history. And I think that approach, which, yeah, maybe we'll come back to talk about this as another big issue, you know, how we as historians or as wargamers, we have an idea of the game we want to play. To what extent do we slavishly follow history? Or to what extent do we sort of use something which is more alternative? Do we extrapolate from history? Do we get the game that we actually want? And that to me has been a bit of an antidote to always trying different periods, trying different things because there's an element of a campaign here that I want to try and replicate. I think one of the things that I've found really helpful as a guy who doesn't really have a lot of time, to be honest, is to try and create something which is almost like a classic sort of horse and musket scenario, classic horse and musket period, but fit things from different periods around that into the environment of, say, the Spanish Netherlands in the late 17th century. And that's really the genesis behind the whole of the project.
Okay, sounds good. Nick, have you been making anything up?
No, I always try to go on at least make a start in the history books.
Yeah, that's so do I actually. I like that. That's one of the things I like about wargaming is the fact that if you put time in to do the research, you will find what you're looking for.
Including learning sort of 17th century Flemish. It's very
Yeah.
useful.
Yeah. Well, we're doing Confederates versus Zulus tomorrow.
But
I think I'll get my
thanks.
Plausible.
No thanks.
It's plausible. But you know, it is plausible though, isn't it? See, plausible is a kind of buzzword at the moment in wargaming, but you're talking about something here which is, you can create it based on what you believe and understand to be the case at the time, and that enables you to will something out that you're happy with and will bore us to death for 2 or 3 hours.
No, but I think to be serious, well, looking at Sid's situation, there's a wonderful opportunity there to actually to use the evidence that there is, and then allow yourself a little bit of leeway for embellishment and having a bit of fun. Now, you're a very artistic guy, Sidney, so getting to design a few flags must be quite nice. Better than your day job of frocks and hats.
Flags and uniforms are such a relief after waistcoats and frocks. You're quite right.
And presumably, though, these are off-the-shelf figures, are they? Have you converted
No,
them?
well, they are, definitely the off-the-shelf figures. I've certainly not gone to the point of sculpting my own figures and getting them cast.
You've done some conversions, haven't you?
Yeah, but I try and convert each regiment, so even if it's just down to adding additional feathers or lace, I try with each regiment and each squadron to really add something to make it distinctive. So there's a number of regiments which I've done for winter clothing, and they've got scarves and mufflers on. I've put them in gloves, and then there's some with
lingerie,
Silk.
satin, leather and lace.
Certainly on the French, we've gone over town with some of the lace and some of the wigs and some of the things which really sort of are indicative of that period. And to be quite honest, I do think that that's a lot of fun. Everyone takes the hobby as they find it. You can just be completely accurate in 100%, or you can have an outlet for some additional sort of creativity or imagination. Maybe I've strayed a little bit too far over the line at times.
Would you see yourself as the posh spice of wargaming? That sort of clothes design.
I'm certainly not the scary spice. Let's say that much.
Sidney, you are very scary to us, mate. Yeah, sorry, Nick. So seriously, what have you been? What has been on your workbench this week?
So I'm a little bit like Sidney in as much as I'm still time starved. But French Indian War for me in sharp practice. I'm still cracking through.
You thought about spending less time eating?
No, I've thought about it, but I think the thinking doesn't get me anywhere.
Oh well, talking of fashion, I've been painting World War II French. Sidney, stop laughing. I've been painting World War II French Crusader miniatures because I have been working on the 1940 supplement for Chain of Command. That's really been my big focus. I've got some nice little scenarios that I want to pop up online with the Danes, which we touched on in the last one. But painting French has been the highlight of my constructive time. Slightly frustrating because they have the larger squads, and you think, oh, I'm nearly halfway there, and you're not, but because they've got larger forces. But the great thing about the French is they've got some really pretty vehicles, and they're really interesting force to game with. So my focus has been on getting them right, along with trying to do some bits and pieces for my AWI forces, because I'm still carrying on with the campaign at the club, based on Swamp Fox, which is going brilliantly. I can't say too much about that because people who are playing in it will be listening.
It's good fun.
But yeah, I bought a load of 28mm bits and pieces from Grand Manor, because they have gone from producing all sorts of bits in bare resin to simply doing painted stuff now, which is the way they started out, I believe. So in the first, before they decided to shut up shop, I bought a load of bits and pieces in 28mm scale, which when they arrived I suddenly realised were in 40mm scale. But what I've been able to do is actually just put hacksaw through them. So I had some things like wells, and just by putting a hacksaw through it and sanding it down and putting that top 3/4 of the well back onto the base, I've been able to make them look pretty good for 28mm, and that's left me with a lot of varied terrain which I've been painting up, because I think one of the great pleasures of our hobby is having a table that looks good.
Yeah.
And just, you know, if you've got a table with 3 buildings on, okay, it's fine, but you add a well, and you add a little dairy house out the back, and you add a couple of outside, you know, outbuildings, log stores, whatever, all of a sudden fences, you've got a house becomes a home. So I've been working hard on those sorts of bits and pieces. But as I say, on the production front, it's a chain of command, getting that first Blitzkrieg in the West Handbook together, and that's pretty much at the point now where it's just going to go to the printers. So that should be really exciting.
One of the things I've always enjoyed about your games, Rich, is that you've always gone the extra yard relating to terrain, and I always thought that, you know, if you're going to go to the effort of painting figures nicely, accurately, spending a lot of money relating to, you know, the figures on the every game you play, you should also spend a bit of time on the terrain, because that creates that atmosphere, that creates that spectacle. And we're figure, you know, for most of us, we're figure wargamers, and we do it in different scales, and it doesn't really matter if it's a 2mm or 6mm town, 28mm city or whatever. It all creates that sort of ambience, that creates that atmosphere, which people find still really seductive about wargaming.
Suspension of reality, we've talked about it before. If you can suspend reality and actually envisage that as the Russian village you're fighting through in 1941, you're there, you're in the game, you are immersed in the game.
Yeah.
If it looks like, you know, you've got hills made out of a couple of old books and Granny's curtains draped across it, you simply can't have that same relationship with the experience is going to be different.
Yeah, there's a reason why we're playing miniature war games and not chess. You know, we're not interested in just black and white squares. We really want to try and create something, you know, however far we go down that road, of something which is, you know, similar to real life.
And there are great ranges out there that offer you the ability to do that now. You know, there are so many places you can go for individual terrain items.
Oh, fabulous.
And you know, I think the key thing here is not to be too period specific. So a wagon or an outbuilding, you know, can cover 400 years if you get the right one and paint it up in the right way. You can use it. You can use it for your ECW War of the Pink
and it's
Spanish
a supply
Wars
wagon for the
through to
Normandy.
absolutely, yeah. And I think that's if you do that well, actually, you can make a little bit go a long way.
And just the ideas. For example, take a wagon, but get some bits and pieces off eBay and put pneumatic tyres on an old wagon. All of a sudden it just looks totally different, and people go, wow, it's a blooming old wagon, but people still go, it's different. It's going back to the old thing that I always said, put telegraph poles in your games, because people will come up to the game and they'll go, cool, telegraph poles, doesn't matter what the rest of the game looks like, but people like them.
So you're saying pimp your wagon
wagon, exactly.
That's it.
Exactly. Okay, well, that was all very illuminating.
It's very interesting in your workshop, Sid.
Yeah,
What
absolutely.
does this button do?
Oh, don't press that.
Don't press that. Well, let's wander back to the studio
This mask's a bit tight.
and see, and that flag's in the way, and see what big issues waiting for us there, Sidney.
So gentlemen, welcome back to the sofa. Last time we met, we discussed how you attempted to present the gamer with a soft centre of plausible historical experience within a thin, crisp coating of an enjoyable game. In that discussion, Richard, you said that one of the first places you go to when starting to design a set of wargames rules is the drill manuals of the period, and that comment inspired Thomas Matthewman to write in, and Thomas says, "Great show, guys! Question: with sharp practice, were you more inspired by novels than historical accounts? What I love about the game is the characters and the mechanism that makes for great storylines." Thanks very much, Thomas. I thought that was a really interesting question, as sharp practice does seem to be all about the story, the narrative. So, Rich and Nick, did you take a different approach with that set of rules as opposed to, for example, Bag the Hun or Chain of Command, where the emphasis is really on small unit tactics or small aircraft manoeuvres and tactics?
Okay. Right, yeah, good question. And the answer is no. Actually, my starting point with sharp practice was Major Dundas's drill manuals. The reason being that you need a solid foundation for any set of rules. And whatever the period, if you want to produce a plausible representation of the way troops fought, you need to understand how troops really fought. Once you've got that as your foundation, you can then build whatever structure you want on top of that. And very definitely, once we understood how the drill worked, once we understood how troops were controlled in battle, we then looked very heavily at fiction and narrative, at film, and also about history, because so often historical facts are stranger than fiction. You know, you can get events that happen in history where if you read them to people, if you presented them as a film script, people would go, that's impossible, that could never happen, that's utterly implausible, but in fact they did. So yes, when you're basing a set of rules on the principle that let's say in the Sharp novels, where you've got Richard Sharp trying to get his men to achieve that elusive 3 rounds a minute firing, where the emphasis is on leaders trying to inspire their men to do just that bit better, go that extra 10% in order to get the edge over the enemy. You have to understand what 100% is, or you have to understand, you know, what the norm is. And then you can understand, right, well, how much further, what could they achieve under the best of leadership. However, I think it's certainly true to say that there is a tremendous amount of inspiration that wargamers can take from the literary world. Now I'll give you an example. I mean, I've been reading a series of books recently by a guy called Adrian Goldsworthy, which is set in the Napoleonic Wars. I mean, you could, if you were extraordinarily cruel, say that they were Sharp clones. They follow the history of the 106th Foot, but you could equally say, if you were being generous, that they're slightly more plausible stories than the Sharp stories. It depends on your perspective on these things. But from my point of view, they present some really enjoyable light reading, which allows you to immerse yourself in the history of the Napoleonic Wars and just simply enjoy the ride. And the reason I mentioned Adrian Goldsworthy, but you could also apply this to Bernard Cornwell, is that these are guys who, they don't just pick up a pen and start writing and make things up about the Napoleonic Wars. Adrian Goldsworthy is a respected historian in his own right, you know, real heavyweight historian. You look at his non-fiction books, The Roman Army at War, 100 BC to 200 AD, Roman Warfare, the Punic Wars, The Complete Roman Army, Caesar, The Life of a Colossus, The Fall of the West, Antony and Cleopatra. This is a guy who is up to his neck in historical plausibility, but he's chosen to write a series of books on the Napoleonic Wars. I think there's about half a dozen out so far, with I am hoping that there are going to be more to come, because I've read all the ones in the series so far and they're a ripping good yarn, really enjoyable. But you can look at other authors as well. Now I've got a book out here from the library, Flashman on the March. Now I don't know about you, but George MacDonald Fraser for me is just a fabulous writer, and Flashman, in many respects, when I was in my early 20s, I decided that if anybody was going to be a model for my moral code, it was going to be Flashman, and and I've attempted to live up to that ever since. Flashman, arch cad, poltroon, amorist, reluctant hero, absolutely fantastic. This book that I've got here, Flashman on the March, and to read the bit in the dust jacket, fleeing from Mexican bandits, rebels, and the French Foreign Legion. He heads off to meet a voluptuous African queen, and he's on his way to nightmare castles, brigand lairs, battles, massacres, and basically we're talking about a war in Abyssinia in the 1860s. Nobody on the planet would have read about this war apart from the most extreme academic, were it not for George MacDonald Fraser writing a Flashman book about it. So this is a fabulous example of how you can take a book of fiction which then exposes you to a conflict that you've never considered before, and then use that as a springboard, just because you're interested, to dip into another book, maybe historical fact, maybe just looking online and looking at the archive of the Times to see what they were saying. And when you look at a Flashman book, for example, one of the most enjoyable things about it is when you look at the footnotes, and they are extensive, because it just shows you how beautifully researched these books have been. But to be honest with you, I've had exactly the same experience with Bernard Cornwell's books. We talked on one of the recent shows about Dux Britanniarum and the research that I went into there with Nennius and with Gildas and with the Venerable Bede. When you read Bernard Cornwell's book on the Arthurian legend, you know that he's been exactly where you've been. You know, his fingerprints are all over those documents. You can see that he's done the research that an historian would do in order to create this semi-fictional world, because the world he's using is the historical world as much as is achievable, and then the characters are weaved into that existence. So I think we can be a bit sniffy sometimes about, is that a book of history, or is that a book of fiction? I mean, I found, certainly when going back to Dux Britanniarum, I actually went on holiday to Portugal, and I took about 12 books with me. Which there was an article in Wargames, Soldiers and Strategy magazine, which was talking about books covering the Arthurian period, and it was one of the best articles I've ever read in a Wargames magazine, because you don't normally get that type of article saying, if you're considering gaming this period, here's 12 books you ought to read. Well, they were fabulous. The stimulation that came from those different views of the post-Roman Britain were just a fabulous read. I took them away on holiday and devoured them. So we can certainly take inspiration every much as from a work of fiction as we can from a history book.
And I think a lot of ways, as you said, fiction is the gateway to history, and it's I think one of the things that you mentioned about Cornwell and Goldsworthy and Fraser is that they're authors who all cross that boundary from history to fiction, because their fiction has a good historical narrative, it's very well researched. But I think what fiction gives you as a wargamer, or also thought it gave you in particular as a wargamer, is it gives you something which counterbalances the technical side of war. It gives you human stories, it focuses on human relationships, and I think that makes it particularly appropriate for games where you've got small groups, almost like large skirmish or skirmishes, because unless you're going to just read drill manuals, you want to have a human context, because that, as wargamers, we enjoy that human context, that replication of human context.
Yeah, that they enable you to make the join, don't they, to move from one into the other. So history books can be very much they're presented as a chronology. This happened, then that happened, then this happened, then that happened, then this happened, then that happened. And they can be some explorations in there about cause and effect. But as you say, the emotional side of it isn't there. We talk a lot about games having narrative as being really very important. And what this kind of fiction does, by setting it against the historical background, it enables you to explore some of that and understand it. Now, the 106th foot that Adrian Goldsworth talked about, is there 106 foot? Exactly. No. So, but how you probably need to know that. Looking at it from the outside, you might not know that.
He tells you that in the
yeah. So, it's, but then again, it's set against a very plausible background, and the events are known and recognised, and it allows you to understand and immerse yourself in the story. And so, if it's done and if it's done well, you can step from the history into the fiction and back again almost seamlessly, without necessarily being fully aware of it. Sometimes I have read some books where actually you don't quite know whether what you're reading is made up or whether it is fact. And of course, when you start dealing with individual eyewitness accounts and what people write about what happened to them, in D-Day, and it's a personal account, well, it's all, some of it is almost fictional. So it's a really kind of tough line, really interesting one to go down. But it's about where they start it. They have to start in history. If you start with the story, then you go off into science fiction or other things. But there's the historical basis that I think means that they got appeal to the wargamer. They give me a start point, and I can start to connect with a sequence of events that paints a picture for me.
Yeah, I've said in the past, what's the first thing I do when I think, does a period interest me? And I've said, I buy an Osprey. But equally, I could just as easily buy a fiction book. If there's one available, if I look on Amazon, it says a ripping yarn about the American War of Independence. Great starting point. Great starting point, because that book will examine things that a history book doesn't examine. As you say, it will talk more about people and their relationships and issues of command. And if that book is well researched, and certainly often this is the case when you know an author who has got a reputation for that, such as Bernard Cornwell, people can potentially be a bit sniffy, but I'm not in the slightest.
Well, I think it puts protagonists in a theatre, doesn't it? So imagine you're in the crowd watching a show.
Yeah.
The history is the background, is the tableau that's laid before you. Not until you drop characters into that can you start to tell the story. And so you can do that through fiction. I think history does it as well, of course, but fiction can also do that.
I think it works particularly well for where you have historical fiction which is focused on character. Perhaps historical fiction has less of a role to play when you're thinking of army level engagements. There's very little fiction which is written about the Napoleonic campaign really from the perspective of Napoleon at Waterloo, although you would say, well, War and Peace does feature Napoleon and Kutuzov as being lead sort of characters, but those narratives tend to be the exception rather than the rule. Certainly in modern fiction, the focus really for people who are writing books which are going to get published in 2018, that's really on the individual that you can relate to. Historical fiction seems to be less familiar in dealing with the larger sort of social forces, military forces behind a whole campaign from the perspective not of the individual but of an army. And I think that if there's one thing, there is a question with historical fiction in my own mind as to it's fantastic in some things, but it does have its limits. We've got to be cautious that we don't mistake historical fiction for being historical reality. And part of the fun really is unpicking the fictional elements which fill in their use of the imagination as opposed to what the historical evidence actually is. And I think for those reasons, books like the Flashman books, where you have a detailed correspondence between the narrative and the footnotes, is really helpful, because then you can actually see, well, what is fiction and what is really
The
evidence.
footnotes will often give you a paper trail of where to go to find out about what happened in reality. I mean, certainly I find when I buy any book, the first thing I do, or when I pick up any book, the first thing I do is I look at the back to see the bibliography, to see which other works are being referenced, because that tells me to what degree I'm going to trust the author. It's about veracity, isn't it? It's about, what am I hoping to get from this? But yeah, I'm not saying that you can simply read works of fiction and then find yourself to be an expert on the Napoleonic Wars. What I'm saying is that for the wargamer, they are often a brilliant starting point. If you've never read a work of history before, or you haven't read anything since you were at school, and for a lot of guys who maybe come from a 40k or science fiction gaming background, where all they've had in terms of being able to read are works published by a company and sold to them with the background for that particular contrived world. If those people are taking their first step into historical wargaming, a great first step would be to buy a novel.
And I think that's a really interesting comparison, because I mean, taking Games Workshop, for instance, and 40k, the 40k universe, one of the big successes of that particular franchise has been Black Library, which produces very, very high quality novels in respect of what they call the fluff, the environment of the galaxy in the 41st millennium or whatever, and it creates the context and the background and the historical, or the quasi sort of historical characters which populate that game franchise, and that's been really, really successful. And in a similar way, you can say to somebody who's coming from that, well, just as you've read Dan Abnett or Aaron Dembski-Bowden about talking about Space Marines or Horus or whatever it is, here's an Adrian Goldsworthy book, and he's going to tell you about Waterloo. It's not a difficult transition from somebody wrote on science fiction to move to historical fiction. Maybe it's probably easier to do that than to go to some heavyweight historical account to start with.
Yeah, I mean, just to give you an example, I mean, I'll pick up one of these books. Here we go, True Soldier Gentleman, which I think was the first book in Adrian Goldsworthy's series. I might be completely wrong on that, but I'm just going to have a flick through here, and here we go. So we've got the Battle of Rolica and the Battle of Imiero, right? Okay, fine, two historical actions. So read the book, and then think, okay, just go to Google and look up those two different battles and see if you can work out which bits he's taken and he's basing the story on. And then that potentially is going to lead you to actually reading about what happened historically. And then from that, maybe you think, actually, I'm not interested. That's a load of rollickers. I'm not interested in that. I'm not going to read any more. Or you might think, I'm really interested in that, and I'm going to go and buy the big book of Rollicker, written by somebody who's a really keen historian on that particular battle. But you're not reliant on the canon of work produced by a company. There is almost an unlimited amount of literature out there, be it fiction or be it historical texts, which you can then turn to. And it's a bit like having a walk in the woods. You don't have to stick to the footpath. You can meander through history as you will, picking up whatever flower you want along the way. And 1 minute it's going to be a book of fiction, and the next minute you think, I'd like to read a bit more about that, because that's interesting.
I think also with games is that we base our games maybe from a historical perspective, so we can produce a historical scenario. This is side A versus side B on the such and such a date in the past, and this is their dispositions, and this is the battle. Now we start from that historical perspective. As soon as you take the first turn, you are creating a piece of fiction. You're creating something that didn't actually happen, because you're playing it through on the war games table. You're taking a departure from what the historical actual outcome was. So we're merging the historical world with the fictional world all the time as wargamers. We're creating characters and put them into that environment. We're creating units. We're creating scenarios. We're creating, for instance, Dawns and Departures, the campaigns that we create in Sharp Practice. They're all fictional. They're based on a historical landscape, but actually the story we create is a fictional one.
Well, the first decision that is made in any game is the point of divergence from reality, isn't it? You know, you can deploy your army exactly as it was historically, but then you as the general have got to make that first decision.
Yes. So, for instance, we can refight Waterloo. Well, if we refought Waterloo, it would go exactly as Waterloo went,
Yeah.
because that was how Waterloo went. But actually, when you refight it, you're looking to learn from it, but you're also looking to see at what point does it diverge, or you know, what if Grouchy turns up, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
And I think going through those sort of mechanisms and going through that thought process is interesting, because I do think as historical wargamers, a lot of us would say at some point you instinctively feel that even though you've made that first move divergence from history, or the campaign has diverted from what your 100 Days campaign would be, often for wargamers there's a sort of slight reticence, at least I feel this, in going too far from that. So for instance, the American Civil War. How many American Civil War campaigns have we played, but how many of them have we had a British intervention on the Confederate side? I mean, that was certainly potentially historical, certainly a plausible event, but very few wargamers, I think, would generally routinely go as far as doing that. Oh, they may wargame the intervention in Canada using those lovely sort of Perry figures or whatever, but British intervention on the Confederate side, lining up Unions against Redcoats and Confederate Grey. There's not many wargames who do that, and I think that's quite interesting. But we are happy with historical fiction, certainly in some places, but I think for many of us, we feel that okay, we can push that envelope so far, but some people will push it further. But at some point, we want to sort of keep the historical footing as firmly towards the ground as we can.
It's got to be a matter of personal choice, hasn't it? Just how far do you want to push the envelope? I mean, I have to admit that if I were gaming an American Civil War campaign, I would find the idea of a British involvement bizarre to the point of ridiculous, personally. But that's just my view on it. However, if you were to have a sharp practice level incident on the Great Lakes, where some British and Union forces facing each other across the American-Canadian boundary got a bit punchy, well, that's not beyond plausibility. And certainly when you chuck into lunatic Fenians going up there, then the whole thing becomes, all bets are off, isn't it? But I mean, the idea of a British expeditionary force landing at, in Georgia, for me, that wouldn't be the type of historical game I would want to play.
Only in Confederate dreams.
Well, yeah, there's an aspect of that to it, isn't there?
But there are also some aspects of wargaming where if you were to only follow the code of history, you'd never play that campaign. So, for instance, anybody who owns a model of HMS Hood would only ever get it out once with pretty poor outcomes.
Yeah. You have the plastic model, I'll have a brick.
That's
over.
That's right. So actually, well, there's something else that you're going to do with this, isn't there? You're not just going to refight that one action. You're going to create it and put it in different situations and see what happens in that situation. You can say the same about any sort of historical scenario.
What I do think, going back to the original question from Thomas, is the fact that there's two ways to study history. Traditionally, there've been a political view of history, which is kings and generals and events, and then there's social history, which is looking at how events of history impact on individuals. I think maybe we are more in the latter school, in that our games are about representing how warfare impacts on individual people, and how people impact on warfare. So it's about the people. It's the people are dominating it, be they the leaders, and that is where that ties in neatly with fiction, because that's about people.
That's a really great point, and it's fantastic to bring us back to Thomas's question, because I mean I was slightly tongue-in-cheek talking about British intervention in the American Civil War, because for me that would be a step too far as well. And I think there's enough imponderables on a basic battlefield. There's enough that we don't know. There's enough which is fascinating about just the interaction between historical evidence and wargaming outcome to keep us busy without going into really sort of kind of quasi-fantasy scenarios.
Thomas asked a question about sharp practice, but if we look into some other rule sets, look at Algae, for instance. So Algernon pulls it off. it's inspired directly from Biggles and
That's all about
W.E.
Biggles.
Johns, you know.
That was all
It's
about.
entirely drawn from that.
Yeah.
Look at and even Napoleonic naval stuff that we do. You know, you cannot be interested in playing Napoleonic naval games without being drawn to the works of Patrick O'Brien or Alexander Kent or any of those pieces of fiction. The whole Aubrey Maturin genre of books is a massive contributor to the way people think about that way that warfare played out
Absolutely.
at sea in those periods. You know.
Absolutely.
Very good.
Yeah, good. Excellent.
Well, in the context of that question, Thomas, thank you so much for that. We've had another stab at historical plausibility and imagination, but at that point we're going to draw that session to a close and we're going to move on to our next segment. So let's wander along the landing and over to the Lard Island Library, where I hope you chaps have got some books that back up what we've just been talking about. So let me ask you, Nick, what are your book choices for this show?
Okay, so I'm going to talk about 3 books, but predominantly leading into one, which I'm going to sort of recommend as one to look at. I don't think there's really anywhere where the world of fiction and history overlap more than in the world of Napoleonic naval, where you get the works of Patrick O'Brien, C.S. Forester, etc., really painting a colourful picture of what it was like to fight at sea in those days. Really good, passionate view of what was going on at sea. So I've taken a couple of books to look at that, because what these guys are very, very good at is painting that picture and putting it in the backdrop of what was going on at that time. So there are a few books that can help us do that. There's a book called Harbours and High Seas, which is by King and Hattendorf, who I think also wrote a book called Jack Tar, which talks about life at sea. So these are guys who have got the knowledge about Napoleonic naval history, and they've applied it to their understanding of the world of Patrick O'Brien and the Aubrey Maturin novels. So they produce an atlas and geographical guide to that world. So it's actually a map, if you like, to help you understand the stories that HMS Surprise and other vessels are placed in. So they talk about the way the stories unfold, and they talk about some of the actions that take place, and they sketch them out in maps, and they show you areas around maps of the world about anchorages and some of the islands that the guys come across. So they're very good at placing that into a historical context. Another one by which is the Hornblower Companion, which goes with the C.S. Forester books, which does the same kind of thing. It talks through the actual actions that the Hornblower takes place in, gives you some pictures and maps that you can use, and in terms of thinking about what you might do for your war game scenarios, etc., gives you some good information you can work on for that.
And Hornblower's good in a way because there's not that many books. I think there's only about a
No.
dozen, but he starts off as a midshipman, and by the end of 12 books, he's an admiral or something like that. So whatever action you want to game at, Hornblower will have 1 or 2 for you.
But the one that I'm going to look at and recommend is a book called HMS Surprise, it's called The Frigate Surprise, and it's around, therefore, the book that is set in the Aubrey Maturin novels, with Jack Aubrey taking command of
That's
the
his
28
first
gun
command
frigate.
in the first book, isn't
Yeah,
it?
and the reason I like this book in particular is that it actually does span HMS Surprise and its story in 2 guises. This book is split to talk about HMS Surprise as in the fictional one that's in the book, and HMS Surprise as in the real one that really served in the Royal Navy at this time. So it talks about life at sea, it talks about how that ship would have been crewed and fought and supplied and kept at sea, and really it's an all-embracing kind of guide to that ship and its crew at that time. And you can see it through the fictional eyes of what that ship gets up to with Jack Aubrey and what happens to it for real. And the pictures and paintings are in the book, which are by a guy called Jeff Hunt, who's a very famous artist of naval ships, are really top quality. And it's by Brian Lavery, who's a very well known name when it comes to naval history books and very well respected. So I would recommend that to people as an excellent introduction and guide to Napoleonic naval wargaming. So you get the frigate, which is of course all the romantic aspects of Napoleonic naval are there, aren't they? The raiding corvette, you know, loose around the sea lanes of the world, running errands and taking part in daring missions. It is all there, both in its fictional form and in its historical incidents as well.
Okay, that's interesting. I think what I found with Patrick O'Brien was that when you first wrote Kiss Me Hardy, I sort of went mad and bought more ships than Napoleon or the Royal Navy had ever had, but in whatever scale they are. What are they? 1/600? I don't know.
1/1200.
1/1200, right. And I read all the Hornblower books, which I enjoyed, but the Patrick O'Brien series, Aubrey Maturin, I absolutely loved. They really have to be read sat in a leather wingback chair with a roaring fire and a decent bottle of claret. Or if you can't get the chair and the fire, just drink enough claret so you imagine that you have got it. And but there's no point in reading some of those books until you've read those fictional works, is there? Because once you've read the fictional works, you can then pick up those books and say, right, how does this fit into the historical world? For example, taking the first one you said, you know, that atlas, and how does what the Surprise did in fiction compare with what it did with reality? And that actually is mirrored in a book that I've chosen. And normally I waffle on about 2 or 3 books and making choices and giving reasons why I've chosen one over the other. But this, for me, there was only one choice this time, and that is The Sharp Companion by Mark Adkin, a detailed historical and military guide to Bernard Cornwell's best-selling series of Sharp novels. And once again, there's no point in reading this until you've read at least a few of the Sharp novels. But this is a fabulous book, and Mark Adkin is a fabulous and well-respected historian. He's written some really superb books: the Waterloo Companion, the Gettysburg Companion, the Trafalgar Companion, the Western Front Companion, all hugely informative books about their particular battles or their particular subjects. And this one is a really, really great introduction. It's a bridge between the fiction of Bernard Cornwell's superb novels and the history that's there. And if you flick through this, you're just going to see nothing at all, because it doesn't land at the pages I want. But so here we go. We've got Sharp's Peninsula, 1808 to 14. It's looking at where the battles were. It's looking at the areas of operation. It's looking at a uniform of a corporal in the South Essex in 1809 when he arrives, how he's equipped, what his uniform is, what his weapons are. The next page, you've got the South Essex drawn up for battle, and it shows you all the positioning of everybody right the way down to the pioneers, the band, the sergeants, the drummers, the colonels, the flags, and it gives you an appreciation and understanding of exactly how those units deployed for action. It gives you breakdowns of the Brown Bess, of the Baker rifle, how they worked, how they were put together. It looks at actions one by one. So it starts off with Sharp's Tiger, with the 1799 action where Sharp was a private and serving under Colonel Wellesley, who went on to become the Duke of Wellington. And it goes through loads and loads of different actions, and it looks at all those battles. So here we go, Talavera. It's got maps of the battles. It talks the way through the actions that actually took place and how that relates to the books. And it's, I don't know how many pages, 300 pages? Yeah, about 300 pages. But if you have never read a historical book before, but you read a few Sharp novels, pick this up, and all of a sudden it gives you context, it explains things that maybe you didn't know, and it's a really, really interesting read. It's one of those books that's a good bedtime read. You can read it for 5 minutes and that section's over, and then you can go on to the next one the next night. It's a lovely, lovely little book. I mean, my copy, I don't know, published in 1980. This is information I should have had to hand. But
It might be quite hard to get hold of now, I think. Is
well, I did look it up yesterday on Amazon, and it's still available.
Okay.
1998. But I had a look on Amazon, and it's still available. And then from this, have a look at other work that Mark Atkin did. Maybe have a look at Mark Atkin's Waterloo Companion, if Napoleonics is your bag.
Well, I would say go to the Trafalgar Companion, which is a brilliant book, and not just an analysis of the battle, but actually the whole way that war was fought to see it.
The whole way of life for people.
Exactly.
And this does exactly the same thing. A way of life within the regiment. How everything fitted together. What the women did. How the siege lines at Bad Hodge were constructed. Just great information and real gripping stories of daring do mixed in with real history. Great read. Sharp Companion, Mark Atkin.
And I should just say before we go on to you, Sid, just to be clear, the book that I was talking about that I would recommend to you is called The Frigate Surprise, the complete story of the ship made famous in the novels of Patrick O'Brian. It's by Brian Lavery with images by Jeff Hunt, and it's published by Conway.
Very good. Well, Richard, I loved your reference to books which are a bridge to history. I thought that was a great reference, and I think that both of your book choices have been really pointing out the way in which history corresponds with fiction. I've gone the other way, and I've chosen two books which are historical but read as fiction. And a lot of the reviewers say in one of the books, this reads like a John Buchan novel, or this reads like a Rudyard Kipling novel. And I've chosen two books about the Great Game, the rivalry between Imperial Britain and Imperial Russia in the 19th century.
Nice.
They're both by a guy called Peter Hopkirk. I think these are pretty well known books. The first one's called The Great Game, on Secret Service in High Asia, and the other one's called On Secret Service in Bolshevik Asia. And they're both quite short books, but they're both a really good read. And they're really about the Great Game, the rivalry between Britain and Russia, and they are full, absolutely packed with almost implausible events, which were taken then by writers like George MacDonald Fraser to embellish, immerse, and include in things like Flashman and the Great Game, Flashman at the Charge, and the original Flashman book. So you meet amazing characters from Victorian India, like Alexander Burns, who was one of these agents of the British Empire working undercover in Afghanistan. You have people like Baron Erngen Sternberg, this completely crazy guy who gets known as the Bloody Baron in the 1920s around Afghanistan and Persia. You have references to Bukhara and Kabul and Herat, the Silk Road. There's a lot of romance in the way that these are written, although the tales are actually brutal and very frequently sort of violent and bloody. But they're a great sort of, they're a great historical narrative, but something which can inform all kinds of wargaming scenarios, whether it's sharp practice or something, which is into the 1920s or 1930s. So rather than just books which are inspired by fiction, here's are two books which really read as fiction, and you read them and think this can't have happened, but yes it did. So they're both really readily available on Amazon. They're both by Oxford University Press. You can pick them up for about £7 or £8 each, and I recommend them both. They're classic and great holiday reading.
That sounds really, really interesting, because there are some lovely figures that I know that Empress do in their Jazz Age imperialism that probably go with that fantastically well, actually.
So this is Secunda Burns, isn't it, who Flashman mentions
It is indeed
constantly.
Secunda Burns and Johnny Nicholson and all of these incredible, basically British civil servants who are working undercover in Central Asia and in particular in Afghanistan in the 1840s, 50s and 60s. And their stories into the 1870s and then 1900s and work against the Bolsheviks. Really quite incredible stories.
Brilliant, excellent. Really nice way that you've complemented our works that are, we've gone full spectrum from fiction through our bridges and into your fact.
Trying to get you back to history. Well, that's all we've got time for tonight, everybody. Thanks very much to Nick and Richard for joining me in Lard Island this evening. Thanks to you all at home for listening. Please do keep your emails and letters coming in with any questions you may have, as well as any big issues that you'd like to have discussed. And finally, we've just got time for me to hand over to Roger and the band, as always, as we say, good night.
Good night.
Good night.
In tonight's show, Sidney Roundwood was joined by Nick Skinner and Richard Clark, with music by Roger Barraclough and his band.